Waiting for news, of course, from the meeting between the CBN and currency dealers. Now, let's move on to East Africa. If Kenya's latest budget is anything to go by, the country's finance minister reckons one of two things. Either Kenya needs a lot less banks, we've got about 42 right now, or the ones that are there need to hold a lot more capital, or perhaps both. The thing is, if Parliament does approve his proposals, commercial banks will now be obliged to have a minimum of at least $50 million in core capital by December 2018. The thing is, right now, the smallest of the top 6 banks in the country, where over half of the sector's assets are concentrated, has over $250 million in core capital already. And that then leads to the question, so what's the latest point of this directive? That's a question I put to a local financial commentator, Carol Musyoka.
You know, before we even look at 2009, let's look at what's happening in 2015. Okay, in 2009, quite a number of banks had to get to that level. But if you look at where we are today in 2015, you have 42 banks, of which 20 banks are way above, or slightly above, or way above the capital requirement that they've put in, which is 5 billion. You've got another 22 banks, of which 8 will just have to double their existing capital to get to the 5 billion, and 14 will have to multiply by about 4.52, about 5 times what the existing capital is. So the question I'd like to ask Ram, I always ask is, what is the mischief that the central bank is trying to cure, or that the Ministry of Finance is trying to cure? Because you have an overbanked industry. Many times you use the raising of capital to try and force a consolidation, but even if you were to try and do that, you've raised the capital, 50% of your existing industry is well capitalized, is well within, and another 8, so that take it to about 75% of your industry will be in that level by the time that you're looking to do. So for me, the million-dollar question is, why are they trying to do it, and why now? One way you can look at it is perhaps they're trying to deepen the level, the options that the government has for public-private partnerships or for borrowing. You have quite a number of, there's a high debt to GDP ratio today in Kenya, and perhaps the government wants to reduce its reliance on external funding and be able to pull on the local banks, and having far more well-capitalized banks will allow a deeper well for which they can dip into for their borrowing. That's one way to look at it. It's another way to say that there'll be other options for infrastructure development, because well-capitalized banks are able to do large ticket transactions and can also do a consortium. So you'll have a large number of banks that can come together in a consortium to do infrastructure projects, which the government would typically have funded by external borrowing.
Because they essentially have a limit to which they can borrow for any one client as a percentage of the capital.
Correct. Although that core capital argument, 25% of your core capital to one lender, doesn't apply when it's the government. However, if you're looking to do a PPP, a public-private partnership, then that would apply, and maybe that is what they're looking at doing. But as the current industry is currently structured, it's definitely not to provide a better offering for the masses. I don't think this is mass-driven, simply because if you look at the 20 banks that currently are at 5 billion and above, they actually market share in terms of deposit accounts, they have 95%.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
because
of the deposit
and a
accounts.
huge chunk of that is just equity.
Yes, yeah. So it's, well, equity, CBA, right?
Oh, yeah, through
KCB,
M-Shwari,
yeah,
yes.
through M-Shwari. So if you look at the number of banks, you know, I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. You have using the Central Bank Supervision Report, December 2014, you have about 28 million bank accounts, deposit accounts in the country, of which 27 are within the 20 banks. So this aim of raising capital is not for Wanjiku. Yeah?
It's not for the ordinary.
It's not for the ordinary. It does not affect him at all, him or her at all.
Would it be fair to argue then that perhaps, in a sense, the finance minister lowballs things? Because, I mean, if he really wanted to force consolidation, 5 billion is drop in the ocean.
Yes, it is. Yes,
so essentially he lowballed it.
Completely. If you wanted to do it, you'd have done it at about 25 billion. Then you'd have really made it quite interesting. So one, the question is why, and they've not come out and told us why they're doing it. Yeah, we already have 42 banks who operate like a cartel. All right, the interest spreads tend to remain within a certain range. You'd expect that the top 5 banks, they have the power to bring those interest rates down, but they don't, because they enjoy, you know, an oligopoly. They can if they wanted to, but they don't. So what's the benefit if you're even reducing it from 42 to 20? You're not going to change the behavior that the current banking industry is doing with regards to pricing of loans, with regards to pricing of bank products. Bank products in this country, or banking in this country, is very expensive, and one of the reasons I posit for why it's so expensive is that we are allowing inefficiencies in the banking industry to be passed through to the customers.
Still in East Africa, India and Tanzania have signed trade agreements worth over $4 billion in a variety of sectors. That includes tourism and agriculture. The deals include a loan agreement between India's Exim Bank and the Tanzanian government on a line of credit worth over $268 million to fund the extension of a pipeline in Tanzania. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says Indian firms are ready to invest more in Tanzania. His Tanzanian counterpart, Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete, has pledged to create a conducive environment for doing business in the country. Over the last 5 years, poverty levels in South Africa have been gradually rising. Today, 2 out of every 10 South Africans have virtually no access to food or shelter. CEOs in the country took up their plight in a campaign that aims to raise money and awareness for the homeless. As Sumitra Naidu reports, they did so by sleeping in the streets.
The CEO Sleep Out initiative started in Australia in 2006. South African CEOs agreed it was time to bring it to the streets of Johannesburg in the middle of winter. Over 200 CEOs traded their comfortable beds and warm homes for a cardboard box.
It's a wonderful experience to understand it and to empathise, but I think it just brings home the kind of what it means and the suffering, and we drive past it every day without really understanding it. I've been scared to do this.
We always identify with things that make a positive contribution to society or communities. We're in nutrition in the main, so we do a lot of that stuff, but this does something slightly different. It also helps humble you again and remind you of the gap between those who have and those who don't.
Each CEO donated $8,000 to the cause. Just over $2 million was raised for Boys and Girls Town, an organization dedicated to helping homeless children.
It's going to make a significant difference to the lives of vulnerable children. The money is going to be applied against basically 4 pillars: health, nutrition, education and shelter.
Well, I think it's a wonderful initiative. It's a way of getting corporate South Africa almost as one to stand up to the challenge. And then it's an unusual opportunity to, in fact, not just put the money on the table, but to actually pitch up and be counted too.
I think it's a great opportunity to mingle with like-minded people, talk about things that are important to us, talk about the future, things that need to change, and share in a wonderful experience.
Poverty and homelessness remains a major problem in South Africa. Every night, thousands of men, women and children have to sleep out on the streets. Many of them die as a result of being exposed to the cold during the winter months. 250 CEOs have come out here tonight in empathy of the poor people of this country and to encourage a culture of big business giving back to society.
Living in the streets is not an easy thing. It's not something you can figure out either. It's one of those things that you kind of survive when you're in it.
Big business in South Africa is often criticized for not doing enough to change the plight of the poor.
We live in a world where there's a lot of inequality, and those of us who run corporations need to understand how the other side live.
It helps not only think about helping those that are destitute or those who are less fortunate, it also helps us think about what we can do to prevent people getting there in the first place.
I think that the social ills that affect a lot of our children are something that as parents and as CEOs and as leaders we should be concerned about.
I was shocked because I thought I was just going to have a piece of cardboard, and now I find that I've got this sort of house that I'm going to sleep in for this evening.
And I think each of us will ultimately be alone with the cold and the hard floor. Which I think is where the magic will really happen.
And as the cold set in, many tucked in for the night. Temperatures dropped to around 5 degrees, all for a good cause. Sumitra Naidu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Now then, a quick run through the markets here for you. All the bourses we track here closing in the red, except of course the EGX 30, which wasn't trading today. Interesting news coming out of Afrin, of course, the proposed restructuring offer. It includes fairly well, controversial for some, debt for equity swap as part of the entire restructuring. The conversion of about $234 million of existing debt into shares of the company, but at the same time, they will be issuing a lot more shares as well. The details of that have just hit the wire, so you can check that out and see if there's any value for you as a shareholder. Fuel smuggling is strangling Benin and Togolese fuel stations. We'll tell you why. And we'll be back in Somalia. ISPs there simply can't keep up with demand for faster and faster speeds.
This is the first year that Africa will have more foreign direct